Welcome everybody to the Innosight webinar exploring the question, what business are you really in? We will be led today by David Duncan. He'll address one of the most important questions driving your organization's strategy. This is Evan Schwartz. I'm your moderator and Director of Storytelling at Innosight. And I'm pleased to introduce our presenter today. Dave Duncan is here in our Boston headquarters. Dave is a senior partner at Innosight. He is co-author along with Innosight co-founder Clay Christensen of the best-selling new book, Competing Against Luck, The Story of Innovation and Customer Choice. We want to hear from you, so we'll be taking breaks to pose some interactive polls and answer your questions. Just type your question in the dialog box in the corner panel, and no need to click or raise your hand. Just type the question right in and feel free to put your personal perspective or company perspective into your question. And so now I turn it over to Dave Duncan.
Thank you, Evan, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining today. The question I'd like to engage you all on over the next hour is the one posed in my title here, which is, what business are you really in? This is the most fundamental, and I will assert the most important question that you can ask about your organization or about any organization. At one level, it's the central question that any strategy must answer, as how you answer it determines where you look for new opportunities, where you look for new growth, who you compete against as you pursue those opportunities, how you compete and how you innovate. And then at a deeper level, how you answer this question reflects how you and the people in your organization understand the very reason for existence of your company. And in the best cases, the way you answer this question can convey a clear sense of purpose that inspires and animates your culture. To illustrate why I think this is so important, I'd like each of you listening to imagine for a moment that you were the CEO of a Fortune 500 company. In fact, I'd like you to consider 3 specific Fortune 500 companies that I'll introduce in a moment. Now, at Innosight, we work with CEOs and other leaders on an almost daily basis, helping them to develop long-term growth and innovation strategies, typically in the context of industries where there's a lot of tumultuous, rapid change. And CEOs, when they're in this situation, have many challenges to worry about, of course, but one of the chronic concerns they have is knowing which emerging signals of change should they be paying attention to, which are real threats, which are opportunities, and which are just noise. And they often awake to alarming media reports declaring that the end is near, either for their industries or their companies or for their jobs. And while the headlines take many forms, if you distill their essence down, they often look something like this. There's a new startup that you've never heard of before, or perhaps a new entrant, an established company coming in to your industry. They're disrupting your company. You always hear this word disruption or disrupting. And not only are they going to upend your organization, but they're going to transform the entire industry. And so the recurring question for you as a leader when you read things like this is, how worried should you be? So I'll introduce 3 specific examples. I'd like you to be thinking about which of these constitutes really concerning disruptive situations versus perhaps things that are less worrisome. And then at the conclusion of that, we'll poll the audience to rank order these areas of examples of potential disruptions. So the first one is Marriott. Suppose you're the CEO of Marriott. It's a company that's been around for about 100 years. They own iconic brands like Ritz-Carlton, Marriott itself, and they're in the business of providing lodging experiences for business travelers, vacationers. And imagine that a few years ago you wake up and you see a headline like this. You hear about a new company called Airbnb that, as far as you can tell, enables people to stay in the basements of strangers while they're traveling. And you read about this, and you not only learn about it, but you read that it poses an existential threat to your company. So the question for you to think about, and again, I'll poll you on this in a moment, is how worried would you be if you're the CEO of Marriott? Second example, imagine you're the CEO of General Motors. Again, in this case, you've been around for over 100 years. You make iconic brands, trucks and cars like Chevrolet, Cadillac. And you read, a couple of years ago that Google is getting into the car business, and they're going to make autonomous vehicles, and that's going to pose a big disruption to you and to the auto industry. same question. How worried would you be if you read something like this? Final example, and this one's maybe a little bit trickier. You are the CEO of State Farm. Again, it's been around for over 100 years, one of the biggest providers of auto and home insurance in the world. And you read about a company called Nest. And for those of you who don't know, Nest makes kind of plug-and-play, at-home security, smoke, fire alarm monitors that you can buy at big box retailers like Best Buy and just plug them in. They don't do anything in insurance, but you read at State Farm that this is in fact a threat to you. So again, same question, how worried would you be? And what I'd like you to do, just to make this interactive, is have you each answer this question. Which of these three incumbents faces the biggest disruptive threat? You can only pick one. Is it Marriott by Airbnb, General Motors by Google, or State Farm by Nest? And we'll give you 30 seconds or so to answer this question and then move on.
Right now, it says.
Yep, and there's a typo in the middle, and it says GM by Uber, but it should say by Google, as it does on the slides. So this is really interesting. It's a fairly even split between these three, and you were only allowed to pick one. And that's typical when I ask live audiences to choose which of these they think will be the most disrupted. There's typically a mix of people who think they should all be very worried versus not worried at all. And that's not surprising because this is, in a sense, a trick question. Because how worried you should be if you are one of these companies depends precisely on how you answer this question, what business are you in? If you are the CEO of Marriott and you think about yourself as being in the hotel business, and you provide high-quality experiences to business travelers and vacationers, you have really nothing to worry about. If you look at Airbnb, they own no hotels. They don't know anything about running hotels, and they're providing a very different experience. So you might think if you define your business that way, you don't need to worry about it. Similarly, if you're General Motors, you've been making cars and trucks for 100 years, you're way down a learning curve on how to do that. Even a company like Google that has tremendous resources at its disposal is way behind. They're a search engine company, so what could they possibly know about how to disrupt you? But in fact, I agree with the people that think that all of these companies are seriously under threat by these disruptions. But my point is that it's not obvious why that is. And so what I'd like to do over the next 45 minutes or so is introduce to you a powerful way to frame the business that you're in such that it provides great clarity to questions like this, and it provides a very clear guide to strategy and innovation. So specifically, I have three goals. The first one is to introduce this way of understanding the business that you're really in. The second is to introduce a way to think about how do you get your company to act like it does too, because those are two very different things. There's understanding what business you're in, and then there's actually operating as if you do as an organization. And finally, I'd like to introduce this as a way to apply a new lens to strategy and innovation. So by way of introduction, to introduce the core idea, I'd like to relay a true story from a few years ago. This is the story of a construction company in Detroit. And a couple of years ago, they hit on what they thought was going to be a great new growth opportunity for them, which was housing for downsizers. So they've done extensive market research, and they identified a clear need in the market for people who were looking to downsize their homes, perhaps because they had just retired, or they're empty nesters, or newly single parents. Anyone who was looking to move into a smaller home that was cheaper, simpler, and easier to manage. As I said, they've done a lot of market research. They validated that a big need existed. They developed and tested what they thought would be a compelling value proposition, which were affordable condos with touches of luxury and a long list of features that you could customize. They ramped up a highly trained sales force, and they rolled out a big ad campaign and took it to market. And while they had a lot of traffic coming in the door to kick the tires, they had very few people that actually purchased the condos. So they went back to the drawing board, they tried innovating. They asked people what features they might add to make their offerings more attractive. They added a range of things like bay windows, granite countertops, but still nothing seemed to move the needle. So they hired a consultant, a really talented and clever guy named Bob Mesta, to come in and try to understand what was going on. And rather than ask people about the features that they wanted, he took a different path. He went and talked to people who actually had made the transition, people who had downsized to a smaller home. And he tried to understand the process that they'd gone through to make this decision and to discern some patterns that would provide clues as to what they might do to move the needle. And apologies here, folks. We're just having a technical difficulty with our presentation. Okay, there we go. And Bob spoke to a bunch of people, and he learned many interesting things. The first thing he learned is what did not matter. He did not see any kind of clear pattern in terms of the demographics of the people that had downsized. And he didn't see a clear, consistent pattern in the feature set that they valued. But he discovered one kind of surprising recurring theme in his conversations, and this was the theme of the dining room table. Although prospective buyers repeatedly told the company they wanted a big living room, they wanted a large second bedroom for guests and visitors, they wanted a large kitchen so they could make entertaining easy, they were really stressed about what to do with their existing dining room table. In many cases, there was simply not enough room in the new units to keep the dining room table. And it was such an important issue for them that they would say things like this: as soon as I figured out what to do with my dining room table, I was free to move. And at first, Bob and the construction company were a little bit mystified like this. In most cases, in most cases, people were referring to well-used, out-of-date furniture that you might consider giving to charity, old pieces of furniture. But it seemed to be really important to them. And as he dug in a little bit deeper, he had a great insight, which was that if you think about your own dining room table, it actually has enormous significance in your life and in your history and your memories. If you think about it, every holiday that's been around the table, your kids grew up around the table, you celebrated birthdays around it, and the table really represents family and the life that someone had built over a long period of time. And this was actually a theme that was broader than just the dining room table, and it related to the fact that what was preventing buyers from making the decision to move was not something that the construction company had failed to offer, but rather the anxiety that came from giving up something that had profound meaning to them and having to give up the life that they had built. One interviewee talked about needing days to clean out just one closet in her house in preparation for the move. And she spent the whole time crying because every decision felt like she had to give up a memory, whether it was an old photograph, children's first grade art projects, and so on. And it was a very painful thing to be going through. And Mesta's insight, I think, is summarized well by this quote from Bob, which is, "I realized we were not in the business of building homes. We were in the business of moving lives." And this is a reframe of how they thought about the business that they were in. Initially, they thought of themselves as being in the construction business, we're in the condo business. But in fact, we're in the business of enabling people to move from one reality to another reality and keep continuity with their life. And this was very important because it led to all sorts of new ideas for how they could innovate. So what would you do if you're competing in the business of moving lives? Well, they introduced long-term storage, so people didn't have to make snap decisions about what they were going to throw away and what they were going to keep. They could just store their stuff for 2 years and go through it at their leisure. They created sorting rooms on site at condos, so people had an additional space to sort through things. They actually reduced the number of features and choices that people had available to them because people felt overwhelmed by all the ability to customize and choice. And of course, they made the dining rooms bigger. And it turned out to be very successful. In a market in Detroit where housing sales were off by 50%, they were able to grow their sales by 25%, and it was very successful. And so the takeaway from this story is that the simple shift in perspective of how they define the business they're in led to a range of innovations that ultimately drove their success. So let me move from this specific story to generalize to some of the main points I'd like to make. We thought that this question of how you define the business you're in was so important that we wrote a whole book addressing it, which is shown here. It's called Competing Against Luck, and the authors were Clay Christensen of the Harvard Business School, Patty Hall, Karen Dillon, and myself. And the question we set out to answer when we were writing it was, why is it so difficult for large, successful companies to sustain that success over the long term? And of course, there's a range of causal factors for that, but we focused on what we think is the most fundamental reason, and this is the tendency of companies over the long term to change how they understand the business they're in, such that they lose sight of what made them successful in the first place. And what is it that makes a new company successful? Again, there are many factors, but for any company to get traction in a market, it has to find some group of customers somewhere and convince them to pull new solutions, which could be products, services, or experiences, into their busy and resource-constrained lives. And while this has to be the primary driver of early success, as companies grow, they often struggle to do that consistently, to develop products and services that customers continue to love. And so we set out in this book first to try to understand and describe why customers pull some new products into their lives, use them and stay loyal to them and not others. And our core insight is suggested by a quote from a marketing professor named Ted Levitt, that people don't want a quarter-inch drill, they want a quarter-inch hole. And what he meant is that your customers don't really care about your products and services as ends in and of themselves. Rather, people are just living their lives day to day, and as they do that, problems arise that they need to solve. Or in the language of our book, jobs pop up that they need to get done. And when those jobs arise, they look around for the best products and services to hire, again in our jobs metaphor, to get those jobs done. Therefore, it's the job to be done and not the products or services that solve for it that are the causal factors behind why people embrace some new innovations and they reject others. And so when companies start out, whether they do this consciously or not, they have to act as if they're in the business of solving for jobs to be of customers. As they grow, they almost inevitably start to think about themselves and, more importantly, act as if they're in the business of solutions versus solving for jobs. So the three key messages here from our book that I want to introduce are the first one, that people don't buy products or services, they hire them to get jobs done in their lives. The second is that jobs explain the why underlying why people embrace some innovations and reject others. And therefore, jobs are the most powerful way to frame the business that you're in, because it links to the driving force behind why your business has any traction at all. And because jobs to be done is such an important concept in our book, I'd like to spend just a little bit more time explaining what we mean by a job and give a couple of examples. So first, our definition of a job to be done. We say that a job to be done is the progress a customer is trying to make in a particular circumstance. And it sounds a little bit odd, I suppose, when you first read it, but we were very precise about the words that we chose to define a job to be done. And this is a different definition than others that have been introduced before. And I will explain why we chose these words via an example. So let me go right back to the housing example that I was just describing. So we might label this job, "Help me move my life." And you can think about that as the kind of headline of the progress that those aspiring downsizers were trying to make. They were in a particular circumstance, and that circumstance related to where they were at that stage of their lives. It related to their family status, their financial status, as well as the range of things that they had accumulated and that they had to move. All of those were important context or circumstance factors that influenced the nature of the progress they were trying to make in that circumstance. And the progress had some complexity to it. It actually had multiple dimensions. So there were functional dimensions, meaning they wanted to simplify their lives, they wanted to save money, maybe wanted to save time. But there were also emotional dimensions to the progress they were trying to make. They wanted to feel connected to their past. They had a lot of anxiety that they wanted to alleviate around moving and potentially being disconnected from their past. And then there were social dimensions to the progress they were trying to make. They wanted to maintain ties with their family, maintain a sense of community. And there were probably other things as well, but the general point is that the progress the customer is trying to make in a particular circumstance has a complexity to it and a structure to it. And typically when we embrace an innovation, it isn't just one narrow thing that we're trying to optimize for, but there's actually a whole set of things that are context-specific and specific to me as a person and what I'm optimizing for. And therefore, if you're trying to introduce a causal theory for why people embrace some innovations and not others, it has to be able to accommodate some degree of complexity and structure to what they're trying to achieve. Just one other quick example, if you think about Uber, I often ask audiences to describe an innovation that they really love and then to talk about why, share with their other audience members why they like it. And Uber inevitably comes up in the list of top 3 things. And people will go on and on about why they love Uber. It's not just because it gets them from point A to point B quickly. There are functional dimensions they love about it. You don't have to carry cash, it's quick, it's clean. You actually don't, because you know when it's going to come, you don't have to waste time waiting, etc. There are emotional dimensions to the progress they're trying to make when they hire Uber. They want to know a cab is available no matter what the weather or location. They want to know exactly when it's arriving. They don't have to worry about tipping correctly and going through the pain of tipping or through the calculation of tipping somebody the right amount. And then there may be social things depending on the person they may be optimizing for. They might want to be seen as environmentally conscious, so they're carpooling. They might want to be kind of trendy and participate in the sharing economy. Or maybe they want to be perceived as successful, so they hire Uber Black. Again, Uber is embraced and by many people, not because it's just solving for one of these dimensions of the progress, but because it's solving for all of these at the same time. And that's why, through the lens of our theory of jobs to be done, it's a compelling innovation. So just to summarize, this first section on the theory of jobs to be done and the idea of jobs to be done, there's 3 main points to take away. The first is, what is a job? It's the progress a customer is trying to make in a particular circumstance. It has the progress they want to make has a complexity to it, and we can dimensionalize it into these functional, emotional, and social dimensions. And then finally, the way you then solve for a job, because it does have that complexity, it requires an experience. So, which could involve a product or a service, and of course it must involve one or the other, but it's typically a whole experience that you're trying to develop to really fully satisfy that job in a way that somebody's going to cause, that's going to cause somebody to pull your solution into their lives. So before I move on, after this really brief introduction to jobs, to how this applies to strategy and defining your business you're in, I thought we could pause here and take a couple of questions.
That's great. Well, please feel free to type in your question in the dialog box. And a few people have asked, will there be a recording of this? And there will be, and you'll receive an email after with the slides as well. And we have one really interesting question to start out. And this is from Evan Shore. He asks, I'm an entrepreneur working on a startup, and the job is way too big for me to create a small prototype. Should I just prototype part of the process that is most painful?
Yeah, well, so I guess the first thing I would say is before you decide what you're going to prototype or not prototype, you want to make sure that you fully understand the job to be done as best you can in the pre-prototype phase. And that means asking the right set of questions that will elicit the right insights that you need in order to orient your prototype. So what do I mean by that? I mean, you first want to understand what are the functional, social, emotional dimensions of the job that your target customer is trying to solve. You also want to carefully delineate what the circumstance is within which they're trying to make that progress along those three dimensions. And circumstances can be things like situational factors, like where are they when they have that job, what are they doing, who are they with, what time is it, or they can be things related to their life stage or their life context, like family status, how old are they, financial status, things like that. And then the last thing you want to ask about as you're trying to develop a full picture of the job is, for that progress that they're trying to achieve, and in that circumstance, how do they define quality, right? What does quality mean relative to any candidate solution that might come along? And once you have that full picture, you have a kind of blueprint for what we call a job spec for any type of solution you might want to develop, because at least at this point, pre-prototype, that's your best hypothesis about what you're solving for. And then I would say, as you think about where you want to point your prototype, you want to focus on the aspects of that job that are most important to those individuals and for which there's the greatest frustration and pain today. And that gives you a way to prioritize where you want to prototype initially. But I can't, what we found in our work, that one of the most useful aspects of the job methodology is that it gives you a simple and very effective way to characterize the right set of insights you need to develop successful innovation. And then as you learn more from your prototypes that you launch, it gives you an ongoing vocabulary and a kind of framework to interpret what you learn.
That's great. We have a question from Kang Vong, who asks a question about the healthcare industry. What would you say is the job to be done in healthcare, specifically in a hospital situation? How would you really break down the functional, emotional, and social jobs?
Yeah, that's a big question, and I think there's more than one job in healthcare, so it's hard to identify just the job. But you can answer that question by asking it of yourself, right? Which is, as an aside, often a really effective way to gain insights into the jobs of others. Just to think about your own context and what are the jobs you have that arise in your own life. And the way that we think about some of the most fundamental jobs in healthcare, it's about attaining the best health that I can have for myself. It's all relative to where I start. It's relative to what I define as good health. It could have dimensions related to not just my physical health, but my mental health, my spiritual health, perhaps even my financial health. And I think ultimately that is the job that patients and individuals actually have. I think hospitals and healthcare systems in general isn't necessarily optimized for, are not necessarily optimized for that job. They're optimized for, in the case of hospitals, intervening in acute situations, which are just a piece of the puzzle of the complete job that I have.
That's great. What about in the B2B scenario? We've had a couple people, including Christian Carrier and Sam Lindsay, say most of these examples are in the consumer space. Is the framework different in B2B? Can you give an example?
Yeah, sure. That's a great question, and all of the examples I have, in this webinar are business to consumer, primarily just because they're intuitive and perhaps a little bit more universal. But it definitely applies to B2B, and we have several examples in our book, stories about people that have applied this successfully in the B2B context. The differences are, in a B2B context,
you're having to understand the jobs of a set of people as opposed to just one person. So if you're selling into a business, you're not selling to a building, right? You're still interacting with humans, and it's typically a system of people that you are selling into and interacting with. And so if you think about the jobs to be done you're solving for, you have to think about the jobs of each of those individuals relative to the role they have on behalf of the organization. So, if you're selling to a group of people that includes the CFO, they're going to be obviously focused on things related to, well, a whole range of things, obviously, but in this made-up example, things related to cost and efficiency and budget. If you're selling to, somebody else, they're going to have a different set of things they're optimizing for relative to the role in the organization. And then each of those people is also going to have their own individual jobs to be done that relate to their own career and pathway in the organization. And so as you're building a picture of the job you're selling to in a B2B context, you have more stakeholders to worry about and a broader set of jobs to be done you need to think about. But it still applies in exactly the same way. And in fact, the emotional dimensions of jobs to be done in a B2B context are often very underemphasized, but are often very, very important.
We have a question from an old friend, Matt Eyring. Hey, Matt, great question about market research techniques. What techniques are most effective in gaining these kinds of jobs-based insights, like in the condo example?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I'll say hi to my old friend Matt as well. The first thing I'll say is that jobs is the guide to the questions that you want to ask and the types of insights you're trying to elicit, regardless of what market research techniques you use. So literally any market research technique can apply job language and methodology. I think, though, that the most effective ones, particularly when you're trying to get underneath the emotional and social dimensions of jobs that are less obvious, anything that is more observational in nature, ethnographic research, or interviews where you can really dig in deep to a particular person's context as opposed to focus groups or surveys are going to be better. And I'd say the least effective market research techniques relative to getting deep jobs insights are quantitative, survey-based techniques. So why don't we move on? So far, introduced some of the basic ideas of jobs to be done, and made the assertion that jobs are the best way to frame the business that you're in. And so what changes if you define your business through the lens of a job? Well, just about everything changes. Who you compete against changes, how you compete, how you innovate, how big your opportunities are and where you look for opportunities, and what trends you should worry about. Recall that in the very beginning we were asking the question, new entrants in our space, how worried should we be? What I'm asserting is that when you look at your business through the lens of jobs to be done, it actually helps you answer that question in a really clear way. So let me give you a quick example, and usually I do this as a bit of a case exercise with the audience. So imagine that you are the leader of a coffee company, and as any good leader would want, you want to sell more coffee. So you might frame your business challenge as, how can I sell more cups of coffee? But if you've bought into this job philosophy, you might start by asking a different question, which is, rather than assume coffee is the solution, why don't I try to get underneath the causal factors behind why people buy coffee and ask, why might people hire a cup of coffee? So think for a moment to yourself, the circumstances that you're in when you hire a cup of coffee and what some of the things are you're trying to solve for. Because of the webinar format, I'm just going to flash a set of answers that I've gotten from live audiences before.
But there are actually a whole range of reasons you might hire a cup of coffee. So one is, I want to have an excuse for an informal chat. So I say to somebody, hey, why don't we just go meet for coffee? I might be at a party or social event, and I just want something to hold in my hand so I don't feel awkward. So I pick up a cup of coffee. Certainly, many of us drink coffee to feel alert and energized. One kind of humorous example I heard from somebody was, I buy coffee so I can get free Wi-Fi. And I've heard a lot of people say it's just part of their morning ritual that kind of gives them a sense of stability and comfort. And in fact, the list can go on and on. And the point is that there are many different jobs for which a cup of coffee is hired as a solution or part of the solution. And all of these constitute potentially different business opportunities, different innovation opportunities. And so let me contrast for a moment a kind of conventional framing of the business you might be in if you're in the coffee business, which is I'm trying to sell more coffee and the problem I'm trying to solve is get people to buy a cup of coffee, versus just one of these examples where it's a job-focused perspective of having an informal chat, say, is the thing I'm solving for. Well, who's the competition if I'm in the coffee business? I'm going to be competing with other solutions, other people that sell coffee, so Starbucks, McDonald's, maybe at-home coffee machines. If I'm trying to help people have an informal chat, I'm going to be competing with things like dinner, maybe they're going to a bar or going to a party, completely different set of competitors. How am I going to compete? Well, if I'm in the coffee business, I'm going to compete by trying to make a better cup of coffee. I'm going to iterate around product features, maybe price. But if I'm in the enable people to have informal chat business, I'm trying to solve for the job, and I'm trying to provide complete experiences that perfectly match up with the dimensions of that job in the circumstance that people would be in. How do I innovate? Well, in the case of the kind of traditional view, my innovation levers are relatively constrained. It's about making a better cup of coffee. It's probably a lot related to product innovation. If I'm in the business of enabling people to have an informal chat, actually the innovation levers I have are much broader because it's all about creating this kind of end-to-end experience. The market size, how I think about what the market is in the conventional case, it's going to be constrained by total coffee sales or perhaps beverage sales. In the case of these other jobs, it's going to be much larger, and maybe I'm going to be focused on markets of non-consumers and completely. And finally, trends that you might worry about if you frame the business you're in as the coffee business. Maybe you're worried about home coffee systems coming in and displacing you, or trends of just people drinking less coffee. On the right-hand side, it might be changes in how people connect or new social media platforms. And these are just all made-up examples, but the point is, if you're in a radically different business with a radically different set of choices if you're on the right versus if you think about yourself as being in the coffee business. And remember, the right-hand side is just one of 5 hypothetical jobs you could hire a cup of coffee for. And many of those, if you think about how Starbucks has innovated, right, they're oriented towards that broader set of jobs. Coffee is still important, and having a high-quality cup of coffee is still important, but there's a whole experience that they've innovated to solve for these broader jobs. And if you're going to compete with them for coffee sales, you need to have this broader perspective. So just to tie this back to one of our examples in the beginning, how worried should State Farm be, right? If you, again, if you think about yourself as being in the business of insurance, auto insurance, life insurance, they wouldn't be worried at all about a company that doesn't know anything about selling insurance and sells these kind of do-it-yourself home monitors that you can just plug in and hook up to your iPhone. But if you think about it from a jobs perspective, and you think about why do people hire insurance, in addition to it being mandated by law in some cases, they hire it to give themselves peace of mind or to preserve and protect the life that they've built for themselves. And if that's the business you're in, then a solution like very effective, simple to use home monitoring devices are directly competing with your insurance solutions, and it's something that you should be worried about. So again, just illustrating how this jobs frame enables you to answer this question, I think, very effectively. So the last topic I wanted to focus on before we take some more questions is, if this all makes sense, then why don't large successful companies define the business they're in through a jobs lens more consistently? And the answer is, if you just think about the kind of life cycle of a company, when they start out as a small company, for them to get any traction in the market at all, they have to, whether they're conscious of it or not, be solving for somebody's job to be done. They're offering a new solution that's better than anything else, such that someone's going to choose to hire that solution and pull it into their lives. But then once they've locked into an initial market with an initial solution, then they start to go into a phase where they're trying to scale. And they start to organize themselves around product lines because they want to create those successful solutions ever more efficiently, make them better and better so they stay ahead of the competition, and their org structure gets defined around products. They develop processes that emphasize efficiency and turning out those same products ever more efficiently and effectively. They track a whole range of data and evaluate new opportunities with a heavy emphasis on data that can lead them to constrain the aperture of how they might innovate. And it typically is very oriented around the products they've already developed. They have external stakeholders like shareholders and market analysts who are evaluating their performance vis-a-vis other companies that make similar solutions. So, think about the quote, customers don't want a quarter-inch drill, they want a quarter-inch hole. Rather than continually think about themselves being in a business of providing holes, they start to think about themselves as a drill company. Market analysts start to compare them to other companies that sell drills and ask questions like, why aren't you getting more market share of the drill market? Why aren't you selling more drills than you sold last month? And shareholders ask the same questions, and it reinforces this idea that they're in the drill business. And finally, the metrics that they measure, the success metrics they measure, tend to focus on things like how many drills are they selling and how effectively. So all of these things conspire, and these are not bad things in and of themselves, because these are the types of things you do when you're scaling your company, but they do tend to force you to drift away in terms of how you behave, and even in how your culture and your leaders think about the business you're in, and push you toward the kind of solution or product-centric view of the world versus a job-centric view of the world. And this leaves you vulnerable to disruption, because some startup that doesn't have that set of constraints will come in and solve a job that you solve maybe partly better than you, and they'll start to get traction, and that's kind of how disruptions take root. So what can you do about that? Well, I'll tell one last story. Again, this is in our book in more detail about an organization that was able to successfully move in the direction of being what we call a jobs-focused organization versus a kind of solution-centric one. And this is the story of Southern New Hampshire University. This is an incredible story that unfolded over the past decade or so. SNHU, 10 years ago or so, had about 3,000 students. It was kind of a sleepy, rural university that had a value proposition around, come to our picturesque campus in this picturesque town, and you'll get a quality education at an affordable price. About 3,000 people 10 years ago. Today they have over 120,000 people, and they've just had explosive growth. They've grown 34% year over year for the past 6 or 7 years. Profitable, and they've won all kinds of national, international innovation awards. And it's just an incredible success story. And
one of the drivers, obviously not the whole driver, but one of the drivers was a shift in how they thought about the business they're in. And it was led by an incredible guy named Paul LeBlanc, who's the president of SNHU, who interviewed and told his story in our book. And when he came into the university, one of the first things he did was ask, well, what jobs do we exist to solve? Why are people hiring us as a solution? And he discovered that, in fact, there was not just one job, but there were two jobs that they were being hired to do, and they were quite different, and they didn't think they were solving for either of them particularly well at the time. The first job was the job to be done of people in the circumstance of just graduating from high school. They're going away from home perhaps for the first time, and Paul referred to this as the coming of age job. And that was a different framing than how they were acting prior to Paul's arrival. And the insight came when they would follow people around on campus visits, and he would listen to the kinds of questions that prospective students asked versus the questions the parents asked. So parents were really interested in things like financial aid and job prospects and the quality of the education. Students were somewhat interested in those things, but they were even more interested in things like, you know, is there a sports team I can root for, or what's the dorm life going to be, or is there a rock climbing wall? You know, they were worried. They were interested in the elements. Hold on a second. We're just having a little bit of technical difficulty here with our slides. There we go. They were interested in the experience they were going to have as they moved into, you know, adulthood, and yet all of the marketing, you know, the way they talked about the value proposition was oriented more around how the parents thought about what the job to be done was. So that was one group that they were focused on. There was another group that was the focus of a part of SNHU that at the time was quite small, which was an emerging online offering where you could get your degree remotely. And the target for that were people who were already out in the working world in a whole range of circumstances. Maybe they had dropped out of high school, maybe they had some high school credit, maybe they had some college credits, they had families, they had kids, they were busy, and they had had all of the coming of age they could handle. And their job to be done was, I want to advance my career. And they weren't interested in having a leisurely 4 years where they could explore the world and life. They were interested in convenience, flexibility, and speed in attaining whatever credential they need to be able to move to the next level. So completely different job to be done, completely different set of dimensions that they were optimizing for, and in a very different context, very different way they would evaluate what quality meant than the traditional students. And so Paul, you know, and his team had these insights, and they set about to transform SNHU such that they could deliver great solutions to both these jobs to be done for both of these segments. And you ask Paul, you know, what had to change in order to do this, and he'll say pretty much everything, right? And I don't have time to go into the whole story here, so I'll just, you know, share in one more slide what he did at a very high level. If you want to read more, you can read about it in our book. But you can think about it as happening in 3 steps. The first was, of course, he needed to understand what the jobs to be done were by asking, you know, all those questions that I described earlier, and then getting pretty detailed about what experiences needed to be provided to solve for it. You know, and just one example, you know, relates to financial aid, right? So the typical approach to financial aid for the coming of age student is you go through a variety of correspondence over regular mail. You send in an application, it gets approved or not a month later, and it's all very slow and unfolds over a period of months. He knew that for the second segment, the Advance My Career segment, they were often stealing time away from their life, from their very busy lives, to explore the possibility of going back to school. Often it's at night after their kids are in bed,
And when they need to get some answers about financial aid, they need it almost instantaneously, or they're not going to be able to go forward in the process. So they have to optimize a way for them to get some indication around financial aid very, very quickly within hours or days. Just one example of how the experience needed to differ for these two segments. The second thing they did is they needed to develop processes to deliver that experience. And Paul will describe how they had to develop literally hundreds of new processes to be able to deliver all the aspects of that experience. And finally, Paul organized, might use different language, but in our language, he organized around the job or the jobs to be done. He set the online organization completely separately. So he actually literally organized the org structure around the jobs, where he had the traditional university focused on the traditional students and a separate campus for the online program. He established different metrics. So there's a whole set of maybe 50 different metrics that they track and hold themselves accountable to, many of which have to do with, are they actually delivering against the experience they need to deliver against the job to be done. And then he's very thoughtful and adamant about clearly communicating the jobs that they exist to solve and embedding that in the culture such that it provides an actual guide for everybody in their day-to-day roles, in their own decision-making. They know what the organization's trying to solve for, and it enables them to make decisions that are aligned with that goal. Just in a nutshell, how they created a jobs-focused organization at SNHU. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip this last poll question, and I will conclude my remarks with just a couple of ideas for what you can do as you think about taking some of these ideas back in your organization, and then we'll have time for a couple questions here at the end. So, the first thing you might ask yourself and your organization is, for your business right now, what is the drill that you're selling versus the whole or the job that you're solving for? And what are those today, and how are those going to change in the future? And what does that reveal to you about who the real competition is? Who's competing with you to solve for those jobs? And then how does that elicit new thinking about how you're going to beat that competition today and in the future? These are just some of the initial questions that we found to be helpful with people embrace these ideas and take them back into their organization. So why don't we pause here? We'll take a couple more questions and then we'll wrap up.
Yeah, and we do have a question that's related just to that from Rick Batty. If you are doing product development by feature management, the drill question, how would you suggest moving to incorporating jobs to be done in an organizational sense?
I mean, you can start by, because jobs is first and foremost a language and a way to describe the insights you want to gather about a customer and a customer opportunity. And you can start by simply adding those to your process for product development. It's an additional set of questions to ask, and it can be incorporated at the front end of a product development process pretty easily. And sometimes we get asked, how does jobs relate to design thinking, right? Is it a different methodology? And it's not. It's actually quite complementary to design thinking. It can be similar to the way it can be simply added on to a product development process. It can be used in a design thinking process as a way to, as a language for driving, the initial set of insights you're gathering around customers in a design thinking process.
That's great. If we have a question from Daniel Ostrower, who goes back to the coffee example, as there's so many different jobs that Starbucks is solving for. How do you prioritize them? Ethnographic research can turn up all the jobs, but what if there's so many? How do How do you choose what to focus on?
Now, so two answers to that question. So in general, you're looking for jobs that are really important to people, for which there's a lot of frustration today with existing solutions. So there's pain associated with them, with not getting them satisfied, and then that are high value to them. And high value could either mean that there are lots and lots of people that think that job is important and unsatisfied, or it could mean there's a few people, but it's so important to them that they would pay a lot to solve those pain points. So that's a general guide, I would say, to the types of jobs you're looking for. The second answer, though, is that there is an art to an art and a science, I would say, to clustering around a job in a way that's going to enable you to innovate against it. And by that I mean, you could go in and surface all of those different jobs, and you would elicit maybe lots of different social, emotional, functional dimensions that people are trying to optimize for. And the work that has to be done, once you gather all those insights, is figuring out how do I group them into a set of jobs, into a job that I'm going to focus on and then develop an experience against. And that actually takes a lot of thought and playing around with different ways of organizing things and then validating through additional, more refined market research afterwards.
And that's great. We only have a minute left, so I think we should wrap it up. One person is asking about the book. What would you suggest after my team reads your book? What follow-up exercises should we go through? This is something we can help with once you get in touch with us, and I'd like to give you a few ways to do that. So thank you, Dave, and thank you all for attending today's webinar on What Business Are You Really In? You'll get an email when the recording of today's session with the slides is available to forward to your colleagues, and we welcome you to visit us at innosight.com. Dave would also welcome to hear from you directly via his email address right on your screen. So on behalf of Innosight, thank you for attending and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.